Good morning. Today is December 13th, 2006. Today we're meeting with Mr. Dale Peterson at his home in Fort Collins, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans Oral History Program. Welcome, Mr. Peterson.
Thank you.
I want to start off by thanking you for participating in this project today. If we could, let's start out. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, when and where you were born?
I was born on February 13th, 1919 in McCook, Nebraska. And when I was 13, we moved to Colorado, Fort Collins, in order to go to the University of CSU. I had 3 older brothers, and my folks couldn't afford to send us to college, so they moved out and had us milk cows while we went to school.
There was how many siblings altogether?
I had 3 older brothers and 2 younger sisters.
Okay, alrighty. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were doing prior to entering the service?
Well, we lived on a dairy farm on West Prospect Street and milked cows and went to school.
Okay. Do you remember where you were when you heard Pearl Harbor had been bombed?
I was taking my sister to she was teaching school at the time when we heard it on the radio. So I was taking her to the bus.
And then how much soon after Pearl Harbor did you go off to the service?
Well, I was taking ROTC at the time, and they let me graduate in May of '42. Graduated on May the 18th and reported to the Army the next day.
Now, did you enlist or were you drafted?
Well, I was taking ROTC, so I got a commission right out of school. So I don't know if you call it, I guess it was voluntary enlistment.
Okay. Where did you you took off the next day? Where did you take off for boot camp, or what was your next step?
First step was Lowry Field, and then from there we went to Camp Roberts, California. From there back to Bowie, Texas, and then from there overseas.
Now, you talking before we started the interview, you said that you'd gone through the war with some friends. Did a bunch of you take off from Fort Collins together, or how did that come together?
Yes, we did. Walt Danielson and Don Redman were good friends in school. We were taking same courses in ROTC, and Walt offered to give me a ride to California, and I accepted. So there were 4 of us that drove out there, and at that time it was hard to get tires, so we went out on a prayer, and we're actually driving on inner tubes when we got there.
Because hard to get tires because of the war shortage and shortages caused
right.
by the war. And
we could not buy a spare tire anywhere.
how long did it take you to get out to California?
2 days.
And out in California, I guess my next question is, what was your specialty, and how did you dive off into that?
This was a camp for recruits coming into the service for the first time.
Okay.
And we helped train new men coming in. I remember I had a captain who would tell the men, now you've got to get those locks cut off by tomorrow morning down to 1.5 inches. Get your mind off of Marilyn Monroe. You're in the Army now. And we were there about 6 weeks then before we got orders to move on to a permanent unit. And fortunately, 3 of us were on the same order to go to Bowie, Texas, Don Redman and Walt Danielson and I.
And what did you do down in Bowie, Texas?
My first job was executive officer in a battery, in a firing battery. And I had that for a few months. And then I was made a survey officer on the battalion staff. And this was a job I knew very little about. In fact, I thought a transit was something you got on a bus, and a cosign was something you did at the bank. So I was really lost. Fortunately, I had a sergeant that knew all about surveying, so I put him in charge of my detail, and I sat back and learned surveying along with the men.
How did you get put into that? Was there any skills or anything that put you into surveying, or how did you?
Apparently, it wasn't because of my skill, because I knew nothing about it. It was just, I don't think they picked you on what you knew. You just took the job they gave you. I remember I was also the trial judge advocate, and I knew nothing about law, so I was happy when we got our orders to go overseas, because then I got rid of that job.
By the time you left Bowie, were you comfortable with your surveying skills and such by then, or?
By then I was.
Yeah.
I knew a little about it.
And then from Bowie, you went overseas. Where did you embark from?
We went by motor convoy to New York and left from New York, and on a ship called the Monticello. And then we zigzagged across the Atlantic. We didn't know where we were going until we got to the Strait of Gibraltar, and then we knew we were headed for Africa. So we landed at Oran. And from there we drove across North Africa in trucks to Bizerti. Took us about 4 days to drive across the desert. From there we went to Naples in a little LCI. By that time the war was close to Cassino, and we went into a firing position just south of Cassino.
Can I back up a little bit and kind of fill in some gaps there? Being from a landlocked state, what was it like crossing the Atlantic on that big ship?
It was exciting, to say the least, especially one day when one of the boilers blew up, and we thought we had been hit by a torpedo. And so our ship was disabled for a while until I got that boiler fixed. So we had a destroyer circling around us for a half a day to protect us, and then we caught up with the convoy.
Did you have your sea legs right away, or did I heard horror stories that a lot of men got sick on those crossings? How was the crossing for you in that regard?
It was not too bad, although our men were all crowded together in a little compartment where they slept one on top of another, about 8 deep, and so the man on top, his sweat ran down through, and so the man on the bottom cot got soaked with sweat. So they were happy to get out of there. They were allowed to go out on deck 2 hours a day. Otherwise, they were confined to that room the whole trip.
How long did it take you to get across?
We were on the water for about 10 days.
Oh, Jesus. And then what was it like to land in Africa and drive across Africa in the desert for 4 days? What was that experience like?
It was quite an experience to go across the country of Tunis. The natives were in tribes like they are today, I suppose, maybe 100 people, and they would camp out on the mountainside and slaughter a lamb and hang it up in a tree, and they rode donkeys, and the children begged for candy. I often thought after the war we should send a dozen B-17s over there and drop a bunch of lifesavers to satisfy those children.
Now, did you experience any fighting crossing Africa, or was the fighting pretty much done?
The fighting was finished in Africa, and they were then, and the landing had been made in Italy when we got there.
And the initial landing had been made in Italy, or did you guys make the initial landing into Naples?
No, we were not in the initial landing.
Okay.
They had been there about 2 months when we got there.
Okay, all right. All right, so now you're up to Cassino, and I'll let you continue with your story from there.
Okay, our first position was about 10 miles from Cassino, and we put our guns in a orange grove, and the mud, of course, at that time was knee deep. And when we tried to pull our guns out of that position, the trucks got stuck, and we had to bring in some bulldozers to pull the trucks out. Then we'd winch the guns away. Then we'd pull the trucks out, and it took all night to move our guns from that position up to the next position. And then our second position was a little bit too far forward, I thought. We were pretty close to the front lines, and there was one company of the 36th Division in front of us. They decided to give them a rest and pull them back and put some foreign troops in front of us. And they didn't last very long. In 3 days, they didn't think much of that war, so they came back through our position. Our doctor treated about 50 of them there that one day, and there was a pile of rifles outside of his tent 3 feet high. They thought they'd had all the war they wanted, so all of a sudden there was nobody in front of us. And so the battalion commander told this one battery to send their men out, set up machine guns on a railroad track in case the Germans tried to come into our position. But it was a real foggy morning, and fortunately the Germans didn't come on. Otherwise they could have captured our guns very easily.
Was there any worry? I mean, what were you thinking about that?
I was scared to death.
Yeah.
But my job at that time was in fire direction, where we plotted the targets, but the targets were all in so close we couldn't fire, and we were just depending on our men to protect us.
Wow. And then eventually fresh shoulders infantry came up and
They had to bring that 36th Division back up. They didn't even have time to get back and clean up, so they come plodding back up through the mud with long beards, and they were tired, and I felt so sorry for them. It was pitiful to see the poor infantry, the things they had to go through.
So, and you want to continue then, you moved ahead forward or eventually, or?
Okay, then, of course, we were there when they bombed the casino and the monastery. We knew they were going to bomb the monastery that day, so we crawled up on a house so we could get a good view. But we noticed when one wave of planes come over, the bomb bay doors were open, and all of a sudden the bombs started falling down and looked like they were going to come right down in our area. So we got off of that house in a hurry. Sure enough, those bombs landed fairly close, shook us up a little.
What is that like? What's it like to be in a bombing like that for people like myself that have no idea what it's like to be in war? And
it's pretty scary. In fact, you learn pretty quick to get in a hole when you see bombs coming down or when you hear a shell coming in. You learn to, I guess, I learned what that passage in my Bible meant, the quick and the dead. So you do learn real quick to take cover.
So they began bombing the casino and the monastery.
Yes, they bombed the monastery and the casino and just made rubble out of it. Then they tried to send our tanks in, but they couldn't get through the streets. They were so cluttered up with debris, and the Germans sat up on the hill and picked them off one at a time. So we could not take casino. So then they pulled us back and moved us over on the coast. And later on that winter then, I think the next spring, we made a push from there and tried to get into Rome. And I was still in fire direction at the time, but on halfway into Rome, the battalion commander called us together one morning and said, Well, the night before, one battery had fired too short, and they almost hit 2nd Corps headquarters. So I heard the battalion commander and exec officer talking during the night about what they were going to do with that battery. They said, there's something wrong there. The men are just not performing right. So the next morning, he called us all together, and when that meeting was over, there were 8 of us had a new job, and I was one of them. He sent me down to that battery to take over as battery commander, and I knew very little about doing that job. But the men were happy to see the change. They apparently got tired of their battery commander, and they wouldn't do their job right. So when I went down, they took off their helmets and threw them in the air and said, yippee, right in front of that battery commander. It wasn't because they wanted me, but they were just glad to get rid of him.
Yeah.
So I thought I knew what was the matter. They had been, I would say, extraordinarily supervised and reprimanded unnecessarily. He was telling the cooks how to cook and the drivers how to drive. And so I decided I'd take the opposite approach. I'd let them do exactly as they had been doing. After all, they'd been in combat for 6 months. They knew their job. They'd been in training for 2 years in the National Guard. So I remember telling them, you do your job and I'll do mine. I'll sign the morning report, go pick out new gun positions, and we'll get along fine. And we did. We got along fine.
And a battery is made up of what, roughly 100 men?
A battery was about 100 men, yes.
Yeah.
That was the scary part, because then I knew that any mistake that I made might cost a man his life. So it was stressful.
You okay? Take a break.
Okay.
We'd left off. You had just taken over the battery. Where were you at this point in Italy?
At this point, we were halfway between Cassino and Rome, and we were moving real fast. But like I said, the battery had fired too short the night before and almost hit the 2nd Corps headquarters, so that's when I took over the battery.
And from there on in, you got along with the men, and the men respected you. There was no any problems from there on out, or did your philosophy, the way you were going to approach commanding it, work out?
That's right. And then I had plenty of time to think about it at night, how I could get those men to perform better. And I came up with an idea of rotating the men. We had a chance to send a man home every 30 days, and I didn't know the men, so I thought, well, the sergeants or chief sections of each section knew the men a lot better than I did, so I'll have them put a name in the hat of who they think ought to go home, and then we'll draw it out of a hat. And this gave an incentive to every man to work as hard as he could, because they wanted to go home. And this worked out real well. In fact, the only time it backfired was when the mess sergeant put his own name in the hat and we happened to draw it.
Well, let's stop a minute before we go forward with as you guys proceeded, and can you just talk about the life in the battery, the life of a soldier, what it was like as far as how was the food, were you getting plenty of sleep, was clothing proper, just conditions that you were living in, either up to this point or if you want to talk about further along in the war, what things were like?
Well, it was most of the time in the winter. We were fighting mud continuously, and of course it was hard to find a dry place to sleep. We did start using some of the buildings later on and took a chance on getting hit. We'd usually dig a slit trench in case we got shelled, we'd have some place to go. But as far as food goes, we always had, most of the time we had plenty to eat. The forward parties, part of the time, ran a little short of rations, but we had good food. And but the men worked hard fighting with those guns to get them into position and handle those big shells. Shells weighed 95 pounds, and they had to keep shoving them in and fighting the mud. When the guns would go off, they'd sink the trails in the mud. They'd have to dig them back out of the mud, cut a log and stick under the trail every so often. And day and night, they had to be ready to fire at a moment's notice. So it was hard on the men, and they did a marvelous job.
Now, would you be receiving fire back as well, or were you far enough back where?
We were constantly being fired upon. However, for every shell that we got, we would probably send back 100. And we did make a New Year's resolution right off the bat. 'Tis better to give than to receive. And that was our philosophy.
Now, in regards to conditions, you said you had a very funny story about your toilet. Can you tell that story?
Yes, in one position we were there long enough that we thought we could build our toilet, so we took some ammunition crates and made a little toilet, put a shelter half over it, and thought we really were living in high heaven. And one night, a Major Sweeney, who was a football player from Missouri. Incidentally, he played against Whizzer White at that time. And he just had to go to the bathroom, but the enemy was dropping a shell in every so often. He said, well, I think I better wait. And the next morning we looked out, and where that toilet was nothing but a big shell crater. They had made a direct hit, and there wasn't even a fragment left. And Major Sweeney said, boy, am I glad I waited. The funny part is he came through here with his wife 2 summers ago and stopped to see me. So I dug out my diary and said, Sweeney, why don't you read that, see if I got it right. He read it. He says, yeah, you got it right, except for one thing. I was so scared I couldn't go for 4 days.
Speaking of scared, how did you guys deal with the stress? How did you? I mean, you probably weren't living in ideal conditions, and to begin with, and then having the stress of war on you. How did you keep going? How did you keep your men going in conditions like that?
Well, we tried to give them a break. Every so often we'd let them go to a rest camp, maybe once every 2 or 3 months, which helped. But some of the men couldn't take it. They had to be sent to the rear. But my men were pretty tough. A lot of them were from Arkansas, and they were tough men. We had men from New York, Chicago also, but they were really a good bunch of men.
Okay. Well, let's move forward now. We'll continue your progress. If you want to continue your story, the progress up the spine, I guess.
Okay. Well, let's talk about going into Rome. That was quite an experience. We were close to Rome, and we were attacked by enemy aircraft, so the men were a little bit afraid of what was going on. But anyhow, right in the middle of this air attack, we got orders to move into Rome. So we took forward parties. That would be a battery commander and maybe a sergeant and a driver and a battalion commander, and we would follow him. And we drove into Rome in the middle of the night, with our driving lights, which were slits on the back of each vehicle. And if you were within 10 yards, you could see 4. If you were 20 yards, you could see 2. And if you were 40 yards, you could see 1. Well, my driver got a little too far behind the battalion commander, and we couldn't see any light. So we got lost right in the middle of Rome in the middle of the night, and couldn't turn our headlights on, but we had radio contact. So we called the colonel, and he said, well, you remember seeing the Coliseum? Yeah, we remember that. Well, go back there and I'll come back and get you. So he came back and picked us up. And from then on, we stayed a little closer to him. Well, then when it got daylight, we stopped, and by that time, the Italians were coming out of their apartments, and they saw that American troops had come in. So they came down on the streets and surrounded us. And by that time, our guns had come in. So they surrounded the guns, and they kissed the men and hugged them and invited them to go to breakfast. And it looked like we were going to lose all of our men for a while. So the colonel gave us march order, told us to move and go into position to fire. And the only place we could find was in a racetrack. So we set up our guns in this racetrack, and I sat up on the bleachers and watched them. However, Rome was an open city, and there hadn't been any shelling or bombing of Rome, and we tried to keep it that way. But by that time, the Germans were going out the other side as we came in the south side.
So there was no fighting in Rome then?
No fighting at all in Rome.
Okay. How long were you then in Rome?
We were only in Rome one day. And
okay.
then,
so you never did get a chance to mingle with the locals and go to breakfast or anything then?
No. Some of the men did go to breakfast, and they caught up with us a little later. But it looked like we were going to lose the whole battalion for a while. But you couldn't blame them. They were ready to celebrate.
Yeah. Okay, so then from Rome, I want to continue your story.
Okay, then from Rome, we proceeded on up, and all of a sudden, one armored battalion decided they needed some heavier firepower. So they decided to take one of our batteries, my battery in particular, and see if we could keep up with this armored column. And this turned out to be one of the most miserable days of my life. The battalion commander told his drivers, if you get hit, or if a tank ahead of you gets hit, you go right on around and keep going. And he told us, try to get in a certain area, and he gave us a map. So we'd went down the road behind these tanks, and then they got ahead of us a ways, but here was a tank blown up in the middle of the road, and we couldn't get by. So we turned around and took another road, and here was the same situation, a tank right in the middle of the road, and we couldn't get around with our guns. So he said, well, maybe you better stay where you are till we get things cleared out a little better. Well, we finally got in a position. By then, we were out of range. He said, bring your guns on up. So we moved 3 times in one day, and men wrestled the guns, put them in position, and by that time we were too far back, and the tanks had gone on ahead of us. Well, then, by the end of the second day, men were so tired they could hardly move, and we stopped to rest, and the next morning, first sergeant came to me and he said, one of the men tried to kill himself. I wonder if you'd come and talk to him. So I went with him, and this man had taken a carbine to his temple and fired it, and here was an ugly bulge over his left eye. He said, "Get away, I want to die." But we got him in an ambulance and sent him off to the hospital. By that time, one of our battalion officers had come in the fire direction center. Incidentally, the battalion had given us 2 extra officers to help with fire direction. So I thought they were taking care of things back there. But anyhow, this major said, "Where have you been? Why don't you get those guns in here to fire?" I told him what I'd been doing. He said, "You let somebody else take care of the men. You get those guns in here to fire." I think that was the only time I really got reprimanded. And I kept thinking what my mother had said, that there would be days like this. Boy, I wish I could have seen her. I wish I could have seen her then. I'm sorry. Okay.
Okay, we'll continue on. If you want to continue on your story, then.
Well, anyhow, I was reprimanded for taking care of the men instead of getting those guns in a position ready to fire. So that was probably the most miserable day of my life.
And then want to continue on where you guys, or anything in that area, or as you moved on?
Okay, then we moved on up through Italy and until we ran into another prepared German position, and we could not get through. So we got stuck there in the winter of 1944. We were up in the Apennines by then, right in the mountains, and there was snow on the passes, maybe 2 or 3 feet deep. But in our position, there was only about 8 inches of snow. But we got stuck in that position then for several months, and we did quite a bit of firing, and we also got fired on quite a bit in that position. And I remember one day I was looking out through my dugout and I saw a shell hit, and here was the clothes flying through the air, and I thought, oh my gosh, they've hit one of our dugouts. So I ran down there to see how bad it was, and 2 of the men had put their clothes in a barracks bag and threw a tarp over it, and that shell had hit that pile of barracks bags, and the clothes were flying through the air. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. But while I was there, I did poke my head in one dugout, and one man had a fragment in his jaw, but he said, "Captain, you better get back in your dugout," while they're firing at us. And later on, after the war, the first sergeant said, the men thought I was crazy out there running around while we were getting fired upon. But, you know, I think that proved to the men that I was concerned about their safety, and I'm sure it helped to get them to do what I wanted them to do. And one of my sergeants later told me that the men loved me. They would have followed me to hell and back. But he came out here from Chicago after the war with his family, and I was glad to hear that. Well, then we finally broke through that enemy position and got into the Po Valley, and from then on things went really fast. The Germans were on the run, and we were right behind them, and we crossed the Po Valley, or the Po River rather, and chased them on up into the Alps, and then they surrendered. And as they came out of the Alps with their guns and men, there was a lot more of them than there was of us. And we were then guarding prisoners for a while. But it was something to think that one day we were shooting at them, the next day we were trying to bargain for one of their Lugers, trading cigarettes, and it was entirely different and quite a relief to think that the war was over.
Had you, up to this point, let me back up a second. As far as communications, a couple questions that way. Did you hear how the rest of the war was going? Say, did you know about the D-Day invasion and how that front was going? And were you getting communications in regards to how the overall war was going? And
oh yes, we knew what was going on. We had radios, so we knew what was going on constantly. And we tried to tell the men what was going on. Occasionally they would wonder what was going on. In fact, I remember one day we did some firing, and we didn't get a report back. I heard some of the men say, "I wonder what's going on up there." One of them said, "Well, must be going pretty good." Another one said, "Well, either that or we fired way too short." But we did try to keep them informed of what was going on.
yeah, yeah. And how about communications from home? Were you able to hear back and forth from home?
My mother was so good about writing. She wrote to me probably every week. And I tell you, she was quite a cheerleader. In fact, in one letter she said, when that class of 1942 ROTC get over there, those Nazis will be sorry they ever started this war. So, yes, we were able, all our mail sometimes would be a month getting there, but most of the time we got mail in 15 days. But it was a lifesaver. Mail, it's what kept us going.
Yeah.
I remember I wrote in my diary that when we had payday, men would get into line. When chow was announced, they'd move a little faster. When a shell came in, they'd get into a slit trench in a split second. But when they said mail call, that's when men really moved.
Now, were any of your older brothers serving at this time?
I had an older brother who was in Lowry Field during the whole service. He was adjutant general at Lowry Field.
Okay.
But he got yellow fever while he was in the Army, so they wouldn't send him overseas. And then I had another brother that decided to take officers training, and he became a second lieutenant, and he went to the Pacific. And he was injured the first day over there, and got pretty seriously injured.
Did your mom, after the war, did your mom ever talk about what it was like for her to cope with not only you and I guess now your brother over in the Pacific, having you guys in harm's way? Did she ever talk about how she dealt with that or what she was feeling this whole time?
She said it was rough. She just just hoped we'd get home safely, and but she was so busy helping my dad milk cows, I guess she didn't have time to worry. But she did worry a lot, I know. But she was so good about writing.
So, okay. So you guys were in the Po Valley when Germany surrendered?
We were right up against the Alps, right up against close to the Swiss border when they surrendered.
Can you describe that day, what it was like when you heard that the war was over and you had made it through, and what that day was like with you and your men? And
our battalion commander told the men they could order a keg of beer for every section, and we're going to take 3 days and celebrate. So we did. We didn't do a thing for 3 days except play cards and relax. And it was very, very satisfying to know that the war was over. The Italians celebrated, I think, more than we did. They thought the war was over in April. They kept going around and saying, La guerra tutta finito, the war is finished. But it wasn't until May the 2nd.
Yeah. And then at that point, did you guys stay there, or did you start moving further north, or what was your what was your responsibility now that official fighting was over?
After the war was over, our job was to guard ordnance depots where all this material had been accumulated, German material and our own, and we set up a guard to keep it intact. And then we moved back to the rear in southern Italy. Along about that time then, there was a little trouble with the Yugoslavians, and we had to move over there and set up our guns. Marshal Tito thought he might want to claim part of Italy, and they decided he shouldn't have it, so we went over there and set up our guns, and he backed down, so there was no firing. But then our job was mainly to guard prisoners.
Did you have a lot of interaction with the prisoners? How were the Germans towards you and such?
The Germans were so well trained and so well disciplined that one of my sergeants says, when they do eyes right, you can hear their eyeballs click. So I think they, but of course they were trained to do things or else. I think they were, I guess you'd say, you can train a horse either with a whip or with a bucket of oats, and they had been trained with a whip. And I decided it was better to use a bucket of oats. And I think in the long run it paid off, because our men, when they used American ingenuity, and when things got tough, they were able to figure out a way to get around it.
Mm-hmm. So you never had any problem, for example, the Japanese would fight to the death. The Germans were pretty much, war was over, and complacent to what you told them to do, and didn't give you any trouble, or?
There was one exception to that, yes. There was one bunch of SS troops, which were German special troops, that decided they didn't want to surrender. So they cut through one of our columns and caused a little problem until we got them straightened out. Otherwise, we had 10,000 Germans inside of one barbed wire, and there was only 600 of us to guard them. So, yeah, they were well behaved. They were glad the war was over also.
Yeah. Throughout the war, did you, aside from that guy that tried to commit suicide, did you lose any men, either to injury or actually killed? And what was that like, as far as from a friendship standpoint or from a leadership standpoint to deal with?
We had some men killed in my battery, but after I took over the battery, we had several men wounded, but I didn't lose a single man, which I was so thankful for. One man stepped on a mine and was almost killed. Another had an accident with his carbine and blew up his shin. And of course we had men injured, but no fatalities. There was one incident I would like to relate, though. Further back, one day we were out looking for new gun positions, and the battalion commander and I were in the same vehicle, and the survey officer was sitting in the back seat. This was Merlin Faulkner from Texas, and he had a map with him, and he said, "Sir, when we go over that next hill, they can see us." But the colonel kept going. And sure enough, when we went over that next hill, here were 3 airbursts right over our head, maybe 1,000 feet in the air. And we knew they were adjusting on us. So we bailed out of our vehicles, and I found a house that had 2 walls standing. So I crawled up in that house and got in the corner where the enemy couldn't hit me. And we were there probably for 30 minutes while they shelled us. And then we finally were able to get out of there, 1 vehicle at a time. Some of the vehicles wouldn't run, so we had to double up. But we did get out of there without losing anybody, and the vehicles were not quite so lucky. But when those shells hit overhead, that got the colonel's attention in a hurry.
Okay, so now the war's over. You're guarding troops. How much longer then were you overseas before you guys finally shipped home? Or
well, the war ended there in May, and I didn't get to come home then until October. In the meantime, I was transferred to a Field Artillery group as a supply officer, which I knew very little about. And we were in training to go to Japan. And but just before the war ended in Japan, I got to go to the French Riviera for a week. And while I was there, they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and the war was over. So we had a big celebration in Cannes on the French Riviera. There were Russian troops, British troops, every troop you could imagine there, and had a big dance out on the street that night, and it was quite a celebration.
Did you have any concept or any idea when they talked about the atomic bomb and how big and destructive it was? Any idea what that, imagine what that could be like?
We had no idea. We just knew that the Japanese surrendered, and we were very much relieved.
Yeah, yeah.
I had 83 points, and you had 85 to get out of the service. So I was afraid I would have to go to Japan, and I was hoping I'd get to stop off at home on the way, but fortunately I didn't have to go.
And then how much longer after that before you finally, you said you got, what, October when you got back home?
Yes, I got home in October of 1945.
Can you talk about that homecoming, what that was like? And also, I forgot to ask you what it was like to leave home. Can you talk about leaving home and coming home? What you were feeling, what it was like in both cases?
Okay, leaving home. The day I left home, my father and my uncle were in the yard when I got ready to leave. My uncle had been in the First War in France as an infantryman, and he knew what it was like. So he broke down, actually. But my dad, I remember the last words he told me was, "Now, when you get over there, you leave those girls alone." So that stuck with me during the war. And there was one incident when it came in real handy I'd like to tell you about. This Merlin Faulkner had gotten married just before we left Texas. And so when we got into Naples, after we'd been on this little LCI for 3 days with K rations, he said, "Let's go down and see if we can find a good meal." So we took a little book that they had given us with some Italian words in it. So it goes down the middle of Naples, and we could not find a cafe or a restaurant. But we stopped a boy on the street, maybe he was 12 years old, and we asked him about a cafe. He didn't know. Cafe, restaurant, no capiche. So we got looked in the book and ran across the word chicken. Oh, he understood chicken. He says, "Follow me, Beniqua." So he took us down the street a couple blocks, went up an alley, started to go up a stairway, We got up halfway up the stairway, and Merlin Faulkner turned around and he said, "Pete, I think this is the wrong kind of chicken." So we turned around and got out of there.
And how was the homecoming? What was
The homecoming was
and
something.
how long had you been away from home? Had you had a chance between the time you left and your various stops and boot camps? Were you able to get home between then at any point?
I got home for Christmas in '42, but that was the last time. And then, so no, my outfit was on the front lines for 492 days. And no, I was in Italy for 27 months without going home. So when I got home, I remember my mother met me at Fort Logan, and that was a sight to see her for the first time.
Wow, wow. And then what did you do after you got home? Shortly thereafter, did you relax for a little bit, or did you go right into work or back to school, or and how was the adjustment going from military life and all that war, being in that war for that long, transitioning now back to a civilian?
I remember saying, "Well, I don't know what I want to do." My mother said, "You don't need to do anything for a while. Just knock around." So I did from October until February. I went back to Nebraska and visited my brother's cafe, and I visited relatives and helped milk the cows and just did not do anything. And then my friend Walt Danielson came one day and said, "Do you want to farm?" I said, "Well, I don't have anything else to do, might as well." So I went with him over to Alt and we started farming. And I kept on doing that for the rest of my life.
Wow. Did you, through the years, did you keep in touch with any of your group? Did you guys have reunions or anything along those lines?
We went to one reunion back in Arkansas, my brother-in-law and I, and some of the men were back there. This was about 40 years after the war ended, but there were a few of the men back. But and I kept in touch with this one friend in Longmont, and we still have dinner with him every now and then. This Don Redmond.
And you'd asked me to ask you about an experience with Don Redmond that you wanted to talk about.
Oh yes, this was quite an experience. I was in Fire Direction Center at the time, and Don was called out to go on an infantry patrol with his radio man and his telephone operator. And they were out in enemy territory, and they got pinned down out there in the middle of the night. The infantry patrol came on back, and there he was. He said every time he moved, this German machine gun opened up on him. So he didn't know exactly what to do. He finally called in his position, and the officer on duty plotted it on the firing chart, but it was in the below the no fire line. It was slightly over in the British sector. So he woke me up and says, "What do we do now?" I said, "Well, we'll have to clear with the British." So we called them, and they said, "Well, it's your chaps out there. If you want to fire, go ahead." So we decided we better only use 4 guns instead of all 12, because we knew that he was putting those rounds right in close to him. So we added 200 yards. We wanted it to be sure and be over. Well, he called back and said, 200 over, fire for effect, which meant to bring the fire back 200 yards and keep firing. So we did that, and that's the last we heard from him. So there we sat, wondering, oh boy, did we fire one too short? Did the gunner forget to ram it in far enough and it fell short? What in the world has happened? and we waited for 2 solid hours wondering. But Don had finally gotten back where he could call in, and he said when those rounds landed, the machine gun quit firing at him. He left the radio and crawled out in this ditch, he and the radio operator. And then the communications officer bawled him out for leaving his radio. But I talked to his radio operator after the war, and he said, we were not about to carry that big old radio out of there. Fortunately, we pushed him back, and Don went back later and got his radio. Well, 2 summers ago, when we were having dinner with him and down at Berthoud, I got around to asking him, well, Don, just how far were you from that machine gun? He said, oh, about 10 yards. 10 yards?
I'll be darned. Wow.
But he said the machine gun was up on a little raise, and apparently he couldn't get it down low enough to hit him. But he went through a lot of scary experiences. If you want to interview somebody who went through some terrible times, he would be the one to talk to.
Wow. How do you think the war affected your life or changed your life, played a role in your life, that war experience? You ever thought about that?
My mother said it put 10 years on my life, but I think it made me grow up in a hurry. You know, when we went in, we were just shaved-tailed, snot-nosed kids that didn't know much of anything. Here we were trying to tell men what to do who were 10 years older and a lot more experienced. So we had to grow up in a hurry, and I think we did. I guess we had to use our heads for something besides a hat rack. My dad always told me to use your head for something besides a hat rack. Well, we had to use our head for something besides a helmet to get through it.
Through the years, have you ever sat down and gone through and read your diary, and has that conjured up any memories? And
yes, I dig out that diary and read through it every once in a while. It brings back a lot of memories. Certainly does.
Yeah. Well, as we start to wind down this interview, is there anything that I didn't ask you, or any stories that, or anything you wanted to talk about that we didn't cover?
Well, I remember in the Stars and Stripes, a little magazine that came out. Every now and then there would be a little article that I would cop out and put in my diary. For instance, here's one that says, I am glad to be an American. It's nice to be free, but I would like to be a puppy if Hitler were a tree. And so we did enjoy getting that Stars and Stripes. First thing we would look at would be Bill Malden's cartoons. He was very good.
Well, as we close down, is there any closing comments or thoughts you would like to make before we closed off the interview?
I think that pretty well covers it. You asked in your questionnaire if there was any stress. Of course there was. There was a lot of stress, but we learned to take it. And I guess if you could say you were not scared, you were only kidding yourself, but you went ahead and did your job because you thought you had to. Because of the folks back home, you just thought you had to do a good job. And so you did the best you knew how.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for participating in this program today, but more importantly, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Peterson, can you describe this here for me?
Well, this was a picture taken right after we graduated from the university, uh, probably about the day we left for Lowry Field, right out of college.
And this is on a cover of a very special book. Can you describe that a little bit?
I kept the letters in an ammunition box that my mother sent to me, as well as everyone else. And when I got home, my daughter-in-law put all those letters in sequence and put them in a book. And then my sister got a hold of that book and decided to type them up and put them in a book. So she did that and came up with this book of 200 and some pages of letters from my mother to me and from me back to my mother. And it includes Battle of Italy. Here was a letter that Sergeant sent me of what it was like to have censorship. And this was a V-mail letter from my mother.
Can you describe to the camera, to the audience, what V-mail was?
V-mail was like everything else, concentrated, reduced in size and weight, so wouldn't have so much tonnage to ship across. It was taken on film and moved across, then put back over there just to save space. V, I later on found out it meant V for victory.
Okay.
I was awarded the Bronze Star, not for anything that I did, but for what the men did. And I was very proud of that. It read about for meritorious service in combat from 24th of November 1943 to the 2nd of May 1945 in Italy. During the battles for Cassino, Rome, Florence, and the Po Valley, Captain Peterson, as battery commander, performed his duties with a high degree of skill, ability, and efficiency. His aggressive action and careful organization of all sections has welded his men together to form a unit that has constantly functioned in a superior manner in actual combat. His leadership, superior performance of duty, and good judgment have been in keeping with the best traditions of the military service. Entered military service from Fort Collins, Colorado, signed by Jeffrey Kreese, Lieutenant General, USA. Just me in a dugout.
Yeah, I'll try to get those here in a minute.
Oh,
Okay.
this is a picture of one of our guns firing. We fired 139,000 rounds while we were in Italy. I think that was the most of any 155 unit in Italy. My brother-in-law helped put this book together with the pictures, and so I'm real proud of the book. There's one picture in here of a position that we were in. Let's see. Oh yeah. This is when we were up in the Apennines, And this is where I saw the shell come in and hit the barracks bags. But my dugout was right under that bush, and the gun was down here under this, had a net. But you can see all the pock marks where the Germans were trying to hit that bridge, and of course a lot of them came into our area. So they did quite a little damage there. One night they hit a pile of ammunition and blew it up, and they hit close to one of the guns and set the net on fire. But we didn't actually lose any men. Just were injured. These represent the campaigns that we were in Italy, and it's a bronze medal, and these were also campaigns that we were in Africa and Italy. This stood for the 5th Army. I was promoted to a major just before the war ended. To California and to Texas. This was Walt Danielson, Don Redmond, Herschel Light, and myself.
All three made it back okay through the war?
Walt was injured, had to come home. He had a shell fragment go off on his knee and was wounded, and he had to come home.
But all four of you survived?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
This is my dad the day we left home, when he gave me that good advice.